Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. As tempted as I was to preach this morning on the second lesson, wow. I decided to preach on the gospel.
Chicken.
And our gospel, yeah, chicken, no kidding. No kidding. Our gospel lesson today is a story about two tough women. Two tough women who worked to solve a problem. So let's take a deeper look at what Mary and Martha did and see if there's anything in what they did that we could consider resilient. Martha first. Martha invites Jesus into her home. She welcomed him into her home. But since it is Martha that is doing the inviting and not a husband, we can infer that Martha is the head of the household. And for a Jewish woman in the first century, this is a sign of great tragedy. It indicates that she is either a widow or has never married. And both of these situations were generally seen by that culture as a sign of God's displeasure. So Martha really had no position in society. And such women were expected to be as invisible as possible and to cling quietly to whatever little life their culture offered. And Jesus' journey brought him to Martha's village, and Martha found him compelling. And so Martha did an unthinkable thing. She invited this stranger, this rabbi, this man, into her house. And I cannot stress enough how socially inappropriate this invitation would have been in that day and age. In receiving Jesus into her house, Martha was, in her own way, selling everything and buying that pearl of great price. This was a bold action that was counter to the culture of the time, an action that ignored propriety, an action that was totally scandalous in that society. But Martha saw that opportunity of great value, and she reached for it, and she ignored everything that was stood in her way. And her actions are both courageous and unsettling. And no doubt the people in that little village of Bethany were going to be taught. And Jesus enters her house and he begins to teach. And he was not chatting about the weather. He was giving his word, the content of his message. And meanwhile, Mary was watching all of this, no doubt with great interest. And it was Mary's turn to take action, time to make a big decision as well. And the issue for Mary was not housework versus study club. It wasn't worship versus service. The issue pulled, again, at the very fabric of society. You see, there were only a few things that a woman could do that were worse than inviting a strange rabbi into your house. But being taught by that rabbi was one of them. Here are two contemporary rabbinical sayings that Mary surely would have known. The rabbi said, "It is better to burn the Torah than to teach it to a woman. And it is better to teach your daughter to be a prostitute than to teach her the Torah." So for a woman to listen to someone teach about the Torah, for her to hear someone teach about God, this is just wrong in her society. But like her sister Martha, Mary too saw a pearl of great value. And she sat down and she began to listen. She began to hear the word of Jesus. And she began to learn. For Mary to do this was unthinkable. This is also a bold action that was counter to the culture of the time. An action that ignored propriety and that was totally scandalous. But Mary too had seen that opportunity of great value and she reached for it, ignoring all that stood in her way. And her action was also courageous and unsettling. And now those people in that village in Bethany have a lot to talk about. Then comes the famous argument. Martha is upset and she goes to Jesus. And she tells Jesus that Mary should be helping. I have all of these things to do. Basically, though, she's telling Jesus that Mary has a role. She has a job to do. And Mary's ignoring her role. It sounds a little bit hypocritical, because Martha stretched past the edges of acceptable behavior with her own calling. And Martha was prepared to extend herself, was prepared to challenge society. She was prepared to do that when she invited Jesus into her home. She would do that to get what she wanted, but she was only prepared to go so far. And Mary, well, Mary was crazy. And what Mary did exceeded even Martha's comfort zone. What Mary did was radical. And even Martha was upset. You see, Mary and Martha are not just symbols. They're also real people. Interesting, gutsy women who, upon encountering the Lord, were willing to risk everything for an opportunity to be with Him. And they both had a problem. They both wanted closeness to Jesus, but the culture in which they lived forbid that opportunity. And Mary and Martha could have been stopped by the obstacles that society put in their way. Could have stopped them, could have allowed them to stop them from having a relationship with Jesus. But they were resilient. And when they realized that the rules by which they lived in society said they could not go forward, Mary and Martha broke those rules. And they reinvented their roles, taking the first steps to reinventing society. This courage, this commitment, this toughness is part of their story. And Jesus was aware of both Mary and Martha. He had seen each of them in turn make her radical choice, and he had supported both decisions. He accepted Martha's invitation, and he entered the house. And he continued to teach as Mary sat at his feet with the other disciples and listened. By the way, both of these decisions were very improper actions for any respectable teacher. But you know what? Jesus was not about maintaining the order of the world. And when Martha got scared by the extent to which Mary pushed the envelope, when Martha became uncomfortable and went to Jesus to complain, Jesus sided with Mary. Martha, Martha, he said, you are worried and distracted by many things, but there is need of only one thing. Martha has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away. In the Diocese of Western Kansas, we have, as a church, been operating a certain way for a long time. And there are exceptions, but there is a standard formula that we use, and that formula is this. We have a building that we call our church. And we meet there every week, usually on Sunday, maybe for an hour or two. And we hold a service in that building. And perhaps the space is used once or twice again during the week, but for the balance of the week, it is not. We support the building. We make repairs as we can afford. We clean it as we can. We heat it and cool it while we are in it. And we maintain it as best we can. But sadly, the population of our diocese is shifting. And people are moving out. They're moving to larger cities. And many towns in western Kansas are shrinking. And with that, our congregations are dwindling as well. Additionally, modern society's attitude towards religion is changing. Whatever the reason, the results are that we have fewer resources, fewer man-hours to give, fewer dollars to spend. And the cost to maintain the buildings do not go down in proportion to the size of the congregation. Instead, most of the costs remain the same. This is a problem for most of us. How will we respond? Well, if we can see the value of continuing to be the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement in our communities, and we can see the value in that, then we're going to have to make bold and tough decisions and find a way to overcome. We will have to be resilient. We're going to have to reinvent the way that we are the church. This past year, St. John's Church in Great Bend has given us a great example of how to respond to this hardship. You will recall that the building the church was using there was beautiful. And it served the church well for many years. But lately, however, the congregation's size had contracted, leaving a smaller parish with a big building and big bills and big needs that they couldn't bear. The building was no longer serving the needs of the parish, and in fact, the cost of maintaining that building were using up most of the parish's resources, using up the resources to the point wherein the parish could do nothing outside of the four walls, as they had nothing left. No more money, no more man hours, no more energy. Nothing left after the burden of the building. Did the parish of St. John's love their building? Of course they did. It was where they had been married, where they had baptized their children and their grandchildren, where they had worshipped for years. They were stuck. They couldn't go forward, and merely maintaining a building is not what we are called by God to do. And if maintaining a building is all that we can do, then we have a problem. St. John saw the value of being the Episcopal Church, the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement. They saw the value of continuing to do that in their community. That was their pearl of great price. So they made a tough decision. They had to part with the building that they loved in order to be that which God had called them to be. So they sold their beloved building. And they sold their building and they reinvented themselves. And St. John's found a new place to meet. And they established a new way of being the church. And for the first time in years, they were able to work in the community outside the four walls of the building. Now St. John's is again involved in the ministry. They're feeding the hungry. They're engaged with the community again. And they're sharing space and resources with other Christians who are also stuck. This has been a radical change. A bold and courageous action, but a necessary one if they were to move forward. It was resilient. Now, all across this diocese, we have problems. And maybe your congregation is facing a different one than St. John's faced. Perhaps instead of a shrinking population, your community is facing dramatic demographic changes. Perhaps the people in your community no longer look like you or talk like you. Perhaps now the members of your congregation are the local minority. The truth is, we all have problems. And as different as they may be, if we want to move forward in our mission, if this is worth it to us, if this is our pearl of great price, we must be resilient. And we're going to have to face some tough decisions, and we're going to have to change more than maybe we want to, and some of it is going to be uncomfortable. We're going to have to reinvent business as usual. But I want you to keep this in mind. Jesus was not about maintaining the order of the world. We should not be either. Be bold, my friends. Be courageous. Courageous. Don't be afraid to find new and fresh ways of being the church. And remember this, when Martha got scared by the extent to which Mary pushed the envelope, when Martha got uncomfortable with the changes, and when she went to Jesus to complain, Jesus sided with Mary. To you, the Diocese of Western Kansas, be resilient. Amen.